Hello, welcome. This is an LGA and EIF webinar focused on the maturity matrix as part of the early years peer reviews. So my name is Ben Lewing, I'm an assistant director at EIF, and with me is Liz.
And I'm Liz Hodgman, I'm the programme manager responsible for the early years speech, language and communication peer review programme.
Excuse me a moment. Just having trouble moving through the slides. There we go. So this is what you can expect to hear about over the next half an hour or so. We're going to go through some of the detail about the maturity matrix as part of the peer challenge, in particular what the matrix covers and how it works, how it is used to prepare local areas for reviews or challenges, and how it can be used to support the work of the peer challenge team. Anyone can join this event, so you are all very welcome, but we are particularly interested in those people who are participating in the peer challenge teams but haven't completed the two-day LGA training. If you have already been on that training, you're going to find this presentation quite familiar, but good to have you as a return viewer. Okay. I'm going to pass over to Liz now just to talk through the LGA's take on all of this.
Thank you. A typical LGA peer challenge involves the scoping of the key lines of inquiry with the council, and this is usually done by myself directly with the directors and maybe other partners. Then the pre-reading by the peer team and the peer team on site for 4 days, followed up by focus groups, meetings and observational visits. And they put a presentation together which is delivered to the stakeholders on day 4 and followed up by a final report. The difference with the early years peer challenges is that the scoping of the key lines of inquiry is done quite differently. So instead of myself doing them with the Director of Children's Services and partners, this is done through the use of the maturity matrix. So it's used as a self-assessment tool within the local area. This enables the scoping to be much more multi-agency rather than it just being council-led. It involves a lot more partners. This is then followed up with a pre-challenge workshop. This brings the partners together to discuss the maturity matrix findings. It helps to identify if there's any gaps and areas for development, as well as priorities that need to be actioned. It helps to identify who needs to be part of the challenge, focus groups or meetings. And this can be very helpful when we're planning the actual challenge with the local authority to look at the timetabling of the focus groups and meetings. It provides a shared language for the challenges across the different professions. This can be quite complex with lots of different organisations having different language and different acronyms, but the matrix really pulls that together. It also provides a baseline against which to measure progress. So when we follow up the original challenges 12 months later with a mini visit, we can use the challenge again, and this will help us evidence the impact the original challenge has had. So the challenges are all funded by the Department for Education, and we deliver them in partnership with the Early Intervention Foundation. And the aim is to have 50% of our challenges to have an EIF associate as an additional peer on the challenge.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I'm going to talk a little bit through the detail now, which will pick up on the points that Liz has made. And then when we reach the end of our slides, we will have a look at the questions that you've posed. So you can ask us a question at any point, and we will collect them and come to them at the very end. So where I wanted to start was to just note some of the challenge drivers and the overall scope. So as you will undoubtedly be aware, the challenges have been commissioned by the Department for Education as part of their Social Mobility Action Plan, and the focus at that headline level is on closing the word gap in the early years. The key point I would make here is that although the original driver for this work is about the word gap and a focus on language and communication, that is as part of a broader early years system. So it's the balance between the two which is most important here. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The box that you have on the right-hand side of your slide here is taken from the DFE's slide deck describing its local government programme. And you'll see there that they have three core elements of their programme that they see as connecting together. So the peer review or peer challenge programme, the early outcomes fund, and the maturity matrix. And as Liz was saying, the maturity matrix is the common language or the framework which underpins those other two components. I want to talk a little bit about the evidence which supports this focus on language and communication. And I'm drawing on EIF's resources in particular, although there are a range of organisations, including the Communications Trust and the Education Endowment Foundation and others, with a significant interest in the development of language and communication. We published a report towards the end of 2017, which focused on language as a child wellbeing indicator. And the key message, one of the key messages from that report is given in the slide here, essentially saying that we believe that the link between language and other important developmental outcomes for children means that language development should be a primary indicator of child well-being. So in our view, it had insufficient status as that primary indicator of child well-being in the thinking at both a national and a local level. Since then, things have changed quite significantly. In particular, the drive around a focus on language communication, which has brought us to this webinar today, in fact. So language and communication being at the heart of the Social Mobility Action Plan from the DFE's perspective, and a significant range of policy agendas focusing on language and communication. The second review, EIF review, that I would point you towards is our most recent review, which is called Key Competencies in Early Cognitive Development, Things, People, Numbers and Words. And you may not be able to see the detail of this slide, but what it does is it shows language and communication alongside the other crucial things in early cognitive development. So in this slide, it talks about theory of number, theory of mind and object knowledge, and it tracks the developmental milestones between birth and the age of 4. So what I'm trying to show you here is that although a focus on language and communication is in our view hugely important, hence the focus of the peer challenge on language and communication, it sits alongside a number of other essential competencies in early cognitive development. And in fact, those 4 competencies that I was just talking about are only one of 4 broader, again, important child development and early learning domains, which are given in this table here, this diagram here. So I was just talking about cognitive development, but it's clear that also socio-emotional development, physical development and health, and general learning competencies as set out in this slide are also hugely important if children are to thrive in the early years. So what I'm trying to show you here is that balance between a really important focus on language and communication as a key factor for children's development, as part of a broader approach which looks at a balanced system in the early years that takes account of other domains, including socio-emotional development, physical development, and general learning competencies. That balance between language and communication and the broader ambitions of the early years system are really important as part of this challenge process. And finally, from the key competencies report, it's really important to note that a focus on language and communication, or the broader early years system, doesn't start when children enter the early education system. It starts much earlier. In fact, at the first point of contact between families and the supportive system available, largely through the NHS. So really important that we think about the investment in language and communication from conception onwards. In fact, a healthy birth and a timely birth is one of the key factors listed in this slide, which are significant for the development of language acquisition. Children who are born preterm are much less likely to meet the developmental milestones for language acquisition. So it's a critical factor, trying to find a way to build healthy pregnancies into the local early years system. So now on to the matrix itself. Many of you will have come across our maturity matrix before, hopefully so. We have a whole range of them focused on different topics. They are essentially planning tools. So this, the one used in the peer challenge process, focuses on the early years, including speech, language and communication, and was commissioned by the DfE specifically for the challenge process. And its purpose is to support those involved in local decision making to identify areas of strength and areas for development, and to look at what good progress might be towards a mature local early intervention system. In particular, it is really good at generating discussion about different perspectives on the whole system. Whole systems are too big for one person to really understand and have insight into all of it. It depends on a range of views and opinions, and the matrix is very good at structuring discussion about what that system looks like from different perspectives, and then developing consensus about action. So as I mentioned, a range of different versions of the matrices that you will possibly have seen before. So our first one 5 or 6 years ago looked at a 0 to 19 early intervention system. We have one that focuses on gangs and youth violence, one which is called a planning tool but uses the same structure, which is focused on reducing parental conflict. And for those of you who worked closely with local versions of the Troubled Families National Initiative, you'll be very familiar with the structure from MHCLG's monitoring of troubled families. It draws on a set of core principles. When we created the matrices in the beginning, we used work that had been used elsewhere, including from the Good Governance Institute, but we've developed it over time using the experience of the matrix in over 30 local sites. In fact, by the end of the next 3 or 4 months, it will have been used in almost every local authority area due to work going on at the moment on reducing parental conflict. And also by the end of this peer challenge process, over 30 areas will have used the matrix as well. This is what it looks like. If you want to look at it in more detail, it's published on our website. If you search for the early years maturity matrix, you will find 2 versions. There's an old version which looked at integration in the early years, and this is the newer version which obviously looks at early years and speech, language and communication. The matrices have 4 dimensions: plan, lead, deliver and evaluate. And they are broken down into 10 key elements, as you can see. And so for each of those, we identify 4 progress levels. And at each of those progress levels, we have descriptors which say what you might expect to see at basic, early, substantial, or mature levels. Briefly, those 4 levels describe the following. So at the basic level, you'd expect to see the principle accepted and a commitment to action, but nothing's happened yet. At early progress, you're starting to see initial development. People are taking action, but it doesn't feel embedded yet, and you're not seeing the results of the things that people are doing. Substantial progress is where people have been working on this for a while and are starting to see the results of the work they've been doing, including a positive impact on families. And at the mature level, people have been working on this for a while. They've learned from things that haven't worked as well as those that have. For example, at the strategy level, an area might be onto its 2nd or 3rd iteration of the strategy, and others are looking to the learning of this place because they've learnt a lot through their own development. I'm going to quickly now whiz through each of those elements in the matrix before Liz and I will come back to how the matrix is used as part of the peer challenge. So the first dimension is plan. It has three key elements: strategy, commissioning, and workforce planning. And the matrix covers things like the quality of the local vision and strategy, and for early years services, and whether it includes speech, language, and communication. How much that local strategy considers the whole pathway for families from maternity onwards. What the quality of commissioning is against the strategy, whether there's a good understanding of the market and how it's developed, and whether there's a good understanding of the broader spread of resources to support early years strategy, including speech, language, and communication. And then how resources are used to support workforce planning and development, and whether there's a good understanding of the different workforces and their role in that wider maternity and early years system. The second dimension is lead, and that has also three key elements: partnership, leadership, and community ownership. And it covers things like the quality of the strategic partnership arrangements. Does this strategy feel owned and driven by senior stakeholders who work in partnership together? Do they trust each other? Can they get things done? The second element is leadership. And that looks at whether people take the lead as individual champions, whether they're willing to stand up and talk about the early years of speech, language, and communication, and whether there's a culture which is tolerant of innovation, open to innovation and fresh thinking. And then finally, in the lead section, it looks at the role of communities themselves, whether children, young people, and families are involved in strategy and decision making, whether they sit on commissioning panels, whether they're present when the key decisions are being made, whether their experience is used to drive decision making and thinking, whether they're involved in quality assurance of individual services, and crucially, whether community assets themselves are part of this local story. So are communities delivering support themselves, peer support? Are they invested in by local organisations so they can find their own solutions? Are they taking a lead in delivery? The third dimension then is on delivery, and it has two key elements: services and interventions, and information and data. So first of all, it looks at what the quality of local services are, either judged through external inspection or indeed through local judgments about quality, and also take-up of entitlements. It looks at how much evidence-based interventions are part of the local offer, both as part of the wider early years system, and particularly on parenting and speech, language, and communication. So is there investment in interventions that have shown that they can work elsewhere? And is there a good understanding about how they're working in the local place? This part of the matrix also looks at the quality of targeting support at priority groups, and whether there are clear pathways for support for vulnerable families, and what the common processes look like. So how organisations work together, and whether they have agreed ways of doing that for identifying vulnerable families, assessing their needs, and providing support. The matrix also looks at the quality of information and data, and this is often one of the areas where local areas score themselves as particularly weak on multi-agency sharing of sensitive data. However, the matrix looks more broadly than just at information sharing of personal data. It also looks at how local intelligence of service effectiveness is shared more broadly to inform strategy. So the aggregated data about services and how that's collected and shared with commissioners and strategic leads. And it also considers the quality of information for parents and carers themselves about services so that they can make their own choices about what's going to work for them, whether that's through a family information service or a local offer online resource. And then finally, the matrix looks at evaluate, which is divided up into two key elements, outcomes and using and generating evidence. And the matrix covers things like how the system uses validated tools, whether there is an outcomes framework, what kinds of shared performance indicators are used across the local partnership to understand progress for families. It also looks at whether there is progress being made for families. So on the key metrics, are things getting better for families across the early years system, but in particular in language and communication. And it looks at whether family experience is measured alongside the quantitative measures of progress. So does the family experience tell the local area whether the system is seamless, whether it feels well connected and coherent? And then finally, on using and generating evidence, the matrix considers whether the local area makes good use of reliable sources of evidence, understands different sorts of evidence and how to distinguish between them, and whether there's a coherent local approach to evaluation, whether there is a sense that the local area is generating good local evidence and building on its own learning rather than constantly innovating and losing touch with things that were tested before but weren't sufficiently evaluated to have confidence that they worked or not. And it looks at whether learning from that local place is then being used to inform future service planning. So that's the matrix. And this now is how we see this being used as part of the peer challenge. As Liz mentioned in her introduction, there is the first step here is before the challenge happens, preparing a local self-assessment. Each local area conducts a stock take to help prepare their local self-assessment. And that could include accessing an online version of the maturity matrix, which is completed individually, and then leading into a multi-agency workshop. There is an offer to every local area that goes through the peer challenge process to have this stock take facilitated by EIF. To date, every local area has wanted that support, but they don't have to. If they have local arrangements for bringing stakeholders together and developing a self-assessment, then they can do that without external support. Once they have had that discussion and identified priorities and thought about their key lines of inquiry locally, then they use that as the basis for discussion with the LGA on where they want to focus the peer challenge. And it's just important to be clear that the idea isn't that they focus on everything in the maturity matrix, or indeed that the peer challenge team goes through the matrix step by step with the local area. The matrix is a tool to help a local area prioritize. So they may choose a subset of the matrix key elements to be their key lines of inquiry, or indeed to use a different set of terms that capture the important cross-cutting themes to them but have been informed by their work on matrix. You can see the graphic at the bottom of this slide, which is taken from a summary report that we provide to local areas of their individual responses to the matrix. What it shows here is people, the numbers in the progress level is essentially people who have picked each progress level, and the darker the color, the more people chose that level. And on the right-hand slide are the rating that they gave it for taking action on that particular dimension. So it's on a rating of 1 to 5. The higher the number, the more important they thought this particular issue was for taking action. So in this example, you can see that the individual responses from local stakeholders rated focusing on improving quality and looking at coordinated working were their top priorities for action. So back to the process before the challenge starts. They've had their discussions with the LGA on key lines of inquiry. They then use the outcomes of their work on the matrix, including what comes out of their multi-entity workshop, to put together a short self-assessment document which they send to the challenge team in advance. And the point of that document is that it's a story of place. It's a brief and concise way of getting the challenge team up to date with what's going on in the local place and pointing the challenge team towards other documents which give more detail. But it's intended to be pithy and concise, telling the story of place. The process before the challenge also helps the local area to identify who they need to gather for the peer challenge team to talk to. So they get a better understanding about what's in scope, what's important to them, what they want to focus on, which helps them think through who they line up to talk to the peer challenge team. Liz, I don't know whether there's anything you want to add at this stage?
No, I think the report that's produced from the self-assessment is really helpful for the peers to view before they go into the challenge, and certainly the ones I've viewed have been really helpful with identifying possible questions.
Okay, good. One thing to say, actually, there are two outputs, I suppose, from this part of the process. So there's a summary report which we produce with local areas that we're working with based on the individual responses to the online survey. And the purpose of that is to inform discussion at the multi-agency workshop. The local area can choose whether or not they share that with a review team. It may be that that's not an accurate description of their local story and they don't feel it's helpful. Most of the time people recognize the story which is based on the individual responses and are quite happy with sharing it, but it's not the same as the self-assessment document which they send in. That's their own version summarizing their discussions and what came out of that summary. So there are the two separate documents. What you may see both. You will definitely see the self-assessment document, but areas may also share their summary of the individual responses as well. So step 2 is during the peer challenge, and 3 points that I would make here. The first is that the matrix itself is the basis of the peer challenge framework, which means that when you look at the peer challenge manual, you will notice that the descriptors and the proposals around key lines of inquiry follow the 10 key elements in the matrix. In fact, it acts as the conceptual framework for the manual and the wider challenge process and provides a common language for both the challenge team and the local area. So you will both be familiar with the matrix in the challenge team and in the local area, and it gives you a way of testing understanding about what's within the scope of the system. Just the point that I made before about specific lines of inquiry, they're those identified by the local area through discussion with the LGA rather than covering all the dimensions of the matrix. Liz, I don't know whether you want to draw out any of the experience from the peer challenges that have happened so far in using the matrix.
Yeah, I think limiting how many specific lines of inquiry you use is really important. As you said, using 10 is not practical. So often we've seen 3 or 4 have been picked out. Some have used the terminology in the actual matrix to develop their key lines, and some have given us a lot more in depth, but stuck to the information from the matrix. So yeah, people have used it in different ways.
And how about during the peer challenges as well? So
during the peer challenges, we've used it to refer back to, and when we're putting together the final presentation, we found it really helpful to use the matrix alongside and use it for the wording sometimes, so that it's wording they're familiar with, and the language again that everyone's familiar with. So that's been very helpful.
We share hard copies of the matrix itself with the people who attend the preparation workshops. So lots of the people that you might be talking to if you're a member of a peer challenge team will already have a copy of the matrix and have seen it. Each peer team has copies of the matrix as well, which are provided as part of the pack. So it does feel like a useful reference document that people can have access to. The point I'd make is that it's not intended as a process that you slavishly follow. It's intended to support the established approach for the peer review process and a useful reference tool. And then finally, step 3, after the peer challenge, the matrix acts as a guide for action planning. So clearly, local areas get involved in the peer challenge because they want it to be a spur to action. They want it to lead to further steps, and the matrix can be a useful tool for doing that. So to give some structure around the action plan which can follow. And it also includes links to useful evidence and practice resources, hyperlinks in the document itself, so people can go and have a look at other people's experience. It's worth noting that we do intend to update the matrix using the experience of local areas that have been making it part of their peer challenge over the past 6 months or so. And we're very keen to add to the references to other evidence sources or resources that local areas feel useful. So if, as you are either receiving a peer challenge or involved in a peer challenge team, if there are things that you spot which you think would be particularly helpful to include in the matrix, then do let us know. It also helps as a baseline against which to measure progress after 12 months. I don't know whether you want to say a little bit more about the LGA's follow-up on 12 months.
Yes, so we're about to pilot one next month, our first one. And it's a smaller team than the original team, but we're trying to take back some of the original team and the original reviewer lead to take back in, looking at the outcomes that came from the last challenge and really focusing on moving them forward and what's been done, have things been embedded, and what action's been taken. So using the matrix will be a really good tool to measure how that's moved forward.
Which is a fantastic new addition actually to the peer challenge process, I think, to have the 12-month follow-up. It should really help local areas to maintain focus. The matrix itself, all of our versions have been used by local areas to do a follow-up after 12 months or 18 months, just to look at whether they feel that they've moved on some of the key local priorities. And the matrix itself can be a basis for a future strategy as well. So that common language that I was talking about before, it can flow into local strategy. And it also provides an opportunity to connect to other local areas who have used it as the same conceptual framework. Is there anything else that you'd want to add on after the peer challenge and use of the matrix or the approach?
No, I think sometimes just a sort of word of caution that sometimes we can, during the peer challenge, come to think that actually that some people have been over ambitious with what they've put in the matrix, and other people have been more cautious. So I think you always need to be aware, and sometimes we do feedback in the final presentation that people may have been a little bit over cautious or over optimistic in the completion of it. But because it's done multi-agency, I think it's more likely to be a more balanced response because it is multi-agency.
I think that's a really good point, actually, that people will approach the matrix in different ways. So some people will see it as an opportunity to raise issues they've been concerned about for a long time that have been left unaddressed, and they won't necessarily be describing the fuller picture of balancing things that are working well with those that aren't. Other people will be very sunny side up, and they will be very enthusiastic about the approach, but they won't necessarily identify the key areas of development or weaknesses in the current approach. I guess the point is about the matrix itself and the information that the local area generates is that it's not an answer. So when individuals are completing the matrix and we help them to put together their summary report and their self-assessment, it's a set of questions, things that they are concerned about, areas that they want to improve, rather than the matrix itself giving a set of numbers which are true. The real strength of the matrix is as a discussion tool to get people talking to each other, thinking about the different aspects of their system and how they make improvements. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our slide deck. So what we're going to do now is answer any questions that you've posed. You can still send us in more questions. There should be a Q&A tab, so if you want to add further questions, then please do. We've got one here from Tanya Richardson, who says, hello, how does one find out which local areas have signed up to this? I think that's signing up to the peer challenge rather than the matrix. So Liz?
At the moment we're delivering challenges. The Department for Education are identifying areas that they would like us to deliver challenges in. We also ask for an expression of interest from local authorities if they would be interested in the challenge, especially in our pilot phase. So we're working with some of those. We encourage local authorities to publish the presentation or the report after the challenge, but it is confidential between them. We don't even give a copy to the Department for Education where they're funding the programme. Some have published their challenges on their website, and we're hoping that more will. So we can't publish a list of who we're actually actively working with.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Tanya. The other common question that we get asked is what happens to the information that the local area generates as part of their work with us. The summary report that we provide based on the online surveys is owned and belongs to the local area. So EIF don't share it with the LGA or indeed with the peer challenge team. It's up to the local area what information they share with you if you're part of the peer challenge team. We have another question from Peter Rentelk. Peter asks, is there a template for the final report? Liz?
Yes, there is one. It should be on the Knowledge Hub. If it isn't, we'll make sure it is on there, but there is one that's available for the challenge managers to use. And it includes the dimensions and the themes from the maturity matrix within there.
Okay, that's all the questions that we've got. I hope that means that we've answered all of your questions about the maturity matrix and the peer challenge. We will be publishing this video for other people to see, this webinar rather, for other people to see in due course. So if you do have colleagues who you think it's helpful for them to know about the maturity matrix, if they're getting involved in a peer challenge, then do point them towards our website where they can find this webinar. I think that brings it to a close. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. Bye now.